Hi, everybody. I'm Carrie, and I'm from the Anderson's events team. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to welcome you to our event with Melinda Wenner Moyer. Thank you all for being here tonight. The Andersons family has been selling books independently since 1875 in the Chicagoland area. So we've made it through some really tough times before, and we're going to make it through this tough time as well. But we just wanted to let you know that your support of this event by attending tonight and your purchase of the book through us, it allows us to remain in business, and we are truly grateful to you all for that. It's been a really rough year. A couple of things about tonight. As mentioned previously, your cameras and microphones are off for the duration of the event because it cuts down on distraction and that dreaded Zoom lag. So please keep them off. If you'd like to ask questions, however, we will have Q&A towards the end after the authors are done speaking. So all you can do is just go ahead and submit your questions through the chat function here in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit them at any time during the event, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. One more thing, if you ordered a book for tonight, I know several of you did already, please know that you'll receive an email when your books are either ready to pick up or they have shipped. And I just want to give you a heads up, this can sometimes take a day or two because we are an independent bookstore. We are not currently sending anyone to space. We do not have the same type of technology or machinery. So sometimes it does sometimes take a day or two for us to get those orders out because we have actual human beings packing them. If you have not ordered your book for tonight, I wanted to remind everybody that signed books make a fabulous gift. And the holidays, I guess, really are right around the corner. When you think about it, we're more than halfway there. So you can just go ahead and order. Everything ordered tonight will be signed, and I'll be putting links to where you go. We've got a couple more joining us. I'll be putting links to how you can order books through us in the chat as well. So with that out of the way, that's all the boring housekeeping stuff. We're going to get going. I want to, of course, introduce Melinda Wenner Moyer. She is with us tonight. She is an award-winning contributing editor at Scientific American, widely read parenting columnist at Slate, and a contributor, hold on, I got more people in the waiting room, to the New York Times new standalone parenting section. And she will be in conversation tonight. This is a real treat to have both of them here. Emily Oster, who's a professor of economics at Brown University and the author of several parenting books. She writes the newsletter Parent Data, and her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Bloomberg. She has 2 children, and she also has another book coming out in 2 weeks. So I will be putting some info about that in the chat as well. And with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you, ladies. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Melinda, I'm so excited to get to do this. And so let me sort of say first, congratulations. It is launch day, and that is a big deal. I will say I first became aware of your work. I first learned about you when I read you on Slate, and I loved your writing on Slate. And I'm super excited about this book, which I also loved. And I would usually, I think at this stage, I'm supposed to like hold up a copy of the book. But I will tell you totally honestly, I was with a friend last weekend and she had pre-ordered the book, but was desperate to read it on our vacation. And so I left it with her. So all I have is this like piece of paper with the advanced phrase and a picture of your book, which everyone should read. But let me just start by asking, like, give the pitch for the book and also tell us why you wrote it. Why a book?
Yeah. Great question. Well, thank you, Emily. So yeah, I never thought I would write a parenting book ever, like in a million years. I mean, I'm not a parenting expert. I do not have a PhD in child development. And so, sometimes other parents would say to me when they would read my Slate columns, they would say, why don't you write a parenting book? This is the obvious thing you should do. But I don't know if you went through this, Emily, when you started writing your books, but I just felt like, who am I to tell other parents what to do? It's not like I have perfect kids and I don't know what I'm doing half the time. But then this was around like 2017, 2018, and I was getting increasingly frustrated by all the bad behavior I was seeing around me from people in positions of political power and from all the various Me Too allegations that were coming to light. And I also saw that rates of bullying and hate crimes had been going up. And I really started worrying about my kids and their future. And I realized what I wanted more than anything else was for my kids not to grow up to be assholes, basically. It just felt really pressing and really important. And I started talking with other parents who were saying the same thing. Like, this felt kind of like the most important thing in this moment in time to be thinking about. And so there was that. And then, given my background in, being a science journalist, I started digging into the research on how kids develop character and values. And it was really interesting because a lot of it was counterintuitive. A lot of it I felt like hadn't really been covered very much in the media. And it just seemed really invaluable. And so that's the point at which I kind of said, I think maybe this is the book that I need to write, because I want to bring all of this work to light. And I think it can be really helpful. And I felt like if I could even just help like a few parents have an easier time of raising wonderful kids, that would be like that would feel really rewarding and really good. And it would help me. So there was that too. And it would help me with my kids. So that's basically, that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to essentially like build a better world through our kids. And then I can tell you a little bit about like how I organized the book, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. And like how I conceived of it.
And also I would say, as part of that, I think it would be great to hear sort of, how do you think people should use the book? And then people ask me this, what do you see people doing with how do you see people using it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, in a lot of ways, parents could kind of jump around the book. So I'll explain how it's organized, and then that'll help understand. So I organized the book in two kind of big sections. And the first section has a bunch of chapters that are based on specific traits or characteristics that I had kind of conceived of as being the opposite of assholery. So when I think about like how to raise kids who aren't assholes, I'm like, what are the parts? What does that mean? What are the parts of that are important? And so I broke it down by these traits like generosity and helpfulness and anti-racism and anti-sexism and resilience and not being lazy. And so when I started digging into the science on these, I realized there was actually like these entire fields of research that were dedicated to these specific traits. And the science on what kinds of parenting shaped these often, not always, but sometimes differed in a way that it felt like it made sense to have these chapters be specific to these traits. I definitely noticed some common threads that were like talking to your kids about feelings, for instance, seems to be very important for a lot of different traits that are part of like raising wonderful kids. But there were also aspects that were kind of distinct. So certainly, like if parents are thinking about a particular trait that they feel like their child is struggling with, they might want to jump to whatever chapter feels the most relevant in that moment in time. Like if they feel like, their kids are just like procrastinating all the time and won't do any schoolwork and aren't interested in school, maybe they want to read the chapter on like motivation and resilience and that kind of thing. And then the second part of the book is, so I did all the research on traits, and then I realized that this was still missing a lot of content that I thought was really important. And that was with regard to like strategies for dealing with difficult topics and issues. So I thought about like, it feels really important to have kids learn how to get along with their siblings. And what do we know about like what parents can do to foster like sibling love, or at least not having your kids kill each other.
Giving them sticks and telling them to just fight. That's one of the main tips. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, okay, you've read the book very carefully.
All right, I'm glad that I covered that part. That's great.
Yeah. Lots of sticks involved. So yeah, then I have this second part of the book that's really like focused on these topics, like how to talk to your kids about sex and pornography. Like that didn't fit into a trait really, other than like how to raise kids who don't like commit sexual assault, I guess would be a trait. I don't know. But so I had this second section that's really like kind of focused on topics and strategies that seemed important and really relevant. So yeah, so it's a book that you can definitely like jump around to the different sections that you feel like are most relevant to you. You don't have to read it from front to back, although I certainly would love that.
I did, and I think people should.
Cover to cover,
So let me ask you like a couple of sort of specific things that struck me that are also things that I sort of thought some about that I've read a little about and reflected on. So one is about, so you talk about sort of growth mindset, and you sort of mentioned this in the motivation, and this is one of those things where I feel like when I was a kid, there was no growth mindset. That was like, I mean, I'm sure that there was a growth mindset. I definitely didn't have it, and nobody told me to have one. But it comes up all the time with my kids. It's like constant sort of this discussion. And so I'm sort of curious both, can you tell us a little bit about sort of what we know about that? What does the research say? But also, do you like me have a sense this is something that like has become more important? And is there kind of like what happened? How come we didn't get a growth mindset?
Yeah, I think Carol Dweck happened. That's what happened.
Okay, Carol Dweck is a good thing to have happened, but all right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like her work was so integral to this shift in my mindset, I guess. But yeah, I totally agree with you that, I mean, when I grew up, this was not a thing. And I mean, and I still think it's something that every parent, even if they've like read Carol Dweck's work, and I mean, I still struggle with because it's so ingrained in us having been raised the way we were, I think. So, I mean, and I think it's perfectly natural to want to tell your kids that they're smart or they're good at soccer or they're, whatever. And also I think it's rooted in this idea in our culture that IQ and ability really are these innate qualities, that they aren't really changeable. Like we're born with whatever IQ we have and it doesn't change. And so what was really interesting when I started digging into the research on this, and like a couple things stood out. One is that there's a lot of people who ended up doing really amazing, brilliant things who were, when they were younger, not necessarily all that impressive. Like, Jackson Pollock, I think, is one. Charles Darwin. There's a bunch of people who apparently, like, I don't know where the information comes from exactly, but weren't all that impressive when they were younger. And also there's some research suggesting that a lot of these like brilliant thinkers didn't have particularly high IQs. And so that kind of suggests, well, okay, either like smarts aren't innate or they can be changed, or maybe like that smarts aren't as important as we thought. Like what you're born with is not as important as what you thought. And there's other research too that's really interesting that has found that IQ itself really is something that's shaped by like we know a lot of research on circumstances and socioeconomic status and culture, but also effort. There's been a couple of studies where researchers have had a group of kids each take IQ tests, and then like 2 weeks later invited them in for a slightly different but very similar IQ test, but then started offering rewards for the answers they got correct, like an M&M, I think, for every answer on the IQ test that they got correct. And then they had a control group of kids they didn't give any candy to the second time. And the scores between the first time and the second time for the kids who were given candy that second time for getting an answer correctly, like their IQ scores went up by an average of 12 points, and some of them went up a lot more, which suggests that, effort does matter when it comes to IQ too. So I thought that was really interesting. So sorry, I'm just giving you a lot of background here.
No, that's good. So somebody, no, that's good. I'm listening.
Okay. So with this in mind, and you think about like what happens when you praise your kids for ability or smarts, like you say they're smart, or you say they're really good at something, then we're kind of reinforcing to them this idea that these are fixed traits, like they were born this way, that they're good at this, end of story. But then you think about, okay, then what happens to that kid when they encounter a challenge or when they mess up? Like if your kid who you've told over and over again is really good at math gets a D on a math test, then how does he or she deal with that? Like she might start to doubt that she had the ability that you told her she had. And since she's thinking of ability as something that's like fixed and doesn't really change, then she's going to start to think maybe I'm actually just not good at math, and that's it. Like, so it causes kids to face and deal with challenges and failure in kind of a really not very constructive way. And I'll mention a study that's really interesting on this. But on the flip side, if you praise kids for effort and you tie effort to outcome, so maybe when your kid does well on a math test, instead of saying you're so good at math, you say, all that studying must have really paid off. Your brain must have kind of grown from it. And therefore you did really great on your math test. Then in those kids, when they face challenges or failures, it's not proof to them that they're bad at the thing. It's just like a stumbling block on the pathway to mastery. And so then they realize like, oh, when I actually work on this, I can get better. Then they have a whole different sort of approach to failure and challenge. And there's research, Carol Dweck's research really illustrates this in like a pretty stunning way. So one particular study that just kind of blew me away because it has like 3 parts and they're all just like, whoa. So she invited kids into her lab and gave them all IQ tests and then either praised them for being smart. I guess she said that she told them they all did very well, but she either praised them for being smart, saying like, you must have done well because you're really smart, or she praised them for working hard at the problems. And then she asked these students what kinds of problems they would like to work on next. And she gave them the option of easy problems that they would probably do really well on, or harder ones that they would maybe not do well on, but would learn more from. And the kids who were praised for their smarts were much more likely to choose the easy problems. And the ones who had been praised for effort were much more likely to choose the challenging ones. So that's the first really interesting part about this study. So that just kind of illustrates that like these kids are going to look at challenges very differently. So in this follow-up, they then gave all these kids hard problems to see what would happen. The ones who were praised for smarts and the ones who were praised for effort. And the ones who were praised for smarts were less likely to continue working on the problems when they started struggling with them. And they also said they enjoyed the problems less. And then 38% of the kids who had been praised for smarts actually lied about how well they had done afterwards. And I think like a very small percentage of the kids who'd been praised for effort had lied. So that's like another really crazy thing. They want to preserve their reputation and their belief in themselves so much that they'll actually lie about how they did. So yeah, that's fascinating. And it all ties in not just to like, I'll stop talking 1 second.
No, this is great.
It's like tied to motivation and resilience and also to self-esteem, because she's also done a lot of work suggesting that the kids who get praised for effort ultimately have higher self-esteem because, again, when they face challenges, they don't think, oh, I'm just bad at this and I'm, never going to get any better. They work through them and they see themselves improving, and like they see these challenges as like opportunities for growth rather than evidence of failure. Anyway,
so like basically I'm supposed to tell my kids, it's great that you tried hard. I'm supposed to praise effort. That's kind of the
yeah. Thing. And like tying that to how they do.
Tying that to their success.
Right. And but it's tricky because like, what if your kid does really well on a math test, but didn't study at all and they just did really well?
Right.
And
you don't want to be like, oh, you must have tried. And they're like, no, I didn't.
No, I didn't. Yeah.
So that didn't try at all.
Right. So I think I asked Carol Dweck that question once, or maybe I've seen she answered it to somebody else, or I saw her something, and she basically said, okay, well, what you could say in that situation is, I'm glad you did well, but it's too bad that you weren't challenged on that test, because when you're challenged, then you learn more, and I wish that you would get tests that actually challenge you, because that's how you learn more. We had this issue. We tried to use growth mindset with my son when he was on a traveling soccer team that was terrible. Like they lost every single game. And he was at first like really upset every time they lost. And then I was trying like to say, well, but you're learning with each time you lose. And at first he was like, I don't know what you're talking about. But towards the end of the season at one point, and I was like, I couldn't believe it. He said, Mom, I think actually I like losing games more than I like winning games, because I really do like learn more from it. And I mean, it like blew me away, because if you know my son, like that's not something that I ever expected him to say, but he really like started adopting that growth mindset, and he still falls back into fixed mindset all the time. And so do I. But I've definitely noticed that his attitude towards like hardship and challenges and failures is much more positive than it used to be.
That's awesome. Okay. All right. So second topic is lying. So you say that I shouldn't, that we're sort of talking about how to get your kids not to lie. And the thing I took away from that, because it's like everything about parenting is always like something like, here's a way to improve your kid, is like, be better yourself. Like, you don't want your kid to use screens. Don't use your own phone. Thanks, internet. But lying is like that too, right? Like this is like, I need to stop lying in front of my kids. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, okay. So first of all, like we're never going to have kids who don't lie, or we're never going to have kids who don't lie, because lying is like
it's a good developmental stage.
It's it's a developmental stage. So like you're never going to prevent it entirely. And it's okay when your kids lie. It is totally normal. And like, it's kind of a sign that your kid's brain is actually working well, because there's a lot of skills involved in lying well, like you have to be able to perceive like what the other person knows and is thinking, and like, keep a story together over time. Like so lying's not all bad, I guess is my point there. But yeah, the more, so again, there's really interesting research that the more kids see adults lying and they know it's a lie, the more that they will lie down the line. And there's like, they've actually like pulled kids into labs and had kids watch adults lie in front of them, and then like pulled the kids into another situation where they were kind of motivated to lie. Like they were told not to look at something. And most of the kids would look, and then the researchers would say, did you look at that? And they would see whether the kids lied. They found like the kids who've just seen adults lie are much more likely to lie. So there's definitely like a lot of modeling that goes into that. If you're lying a lot in front of your kids, but you know, there's different kinds of lies too. And that's relevant. Like,
so this is one that comes up in our house because my husband is a very stringent anti-liar. And like he feels very strongly that we always must be honest with the kids. Like, not that we have to like overshare, but that it's very important to not lie about basically anything. And so that means when the kids ask about Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, we tell them the truth. And so, you know, I once had a conversation, my daughter wasn't very old, and she said to me, you know, is the Tooth Fairy real? And I was like, no, but don't tell anybody. And she said to me, I don't think so, because you already told me other fairies aren't real. All right, fair enough. But like, you know, so, but I think that is something where clearly we are in a, not everyone agrees with that. Right. But the question is, what's the distinction between when somebody says is Santa Claus real, saying yes, and this other kind of lying?
Yeah, right. That's a really good question. And it's so hard too, because you're also like bringing in these cultural expectations and norms, which are, you know, but yeah, this does. So there are different kinds of lies. And if you it's really funny, like to read the research on lying, and like they have all these like fancy terms for different kinds of lies, but basically like there's lying for your own personal gain or to like cover up mistakes. And kids, of course, they love to lie to cover up their mistakes. Like, no, I didn't break the vase. I don't know what you're talking about. And those are pretty like, those are culturally not very acceptable. We frown at those. We don't like those. But then of course there's like the lies like that we consider white lies. And I can't remember the name, the term that they use for these, but it's funny. Which is like lying to either protect people, to not hurt their feelings. And we actually as parents often encourage our kids to lie in this way, because we'll say like, tell Aunt Gertrude that you loved her sweater, you know, and don't say that you don't like the dinner that she served. Like there's all of these ways that we are constantly like asking our kids to lie, those white lies. And I feel like the Santa, the Tooth Fairy lies, they're almost like more along the white lies.
They're sort of like Aunt Gertrude's sweater.
Well, I mean, they seem very different, but at the same time, like we're not lying about Santa like for our own personal gain or to get out of trouble, right? We're doing it because like it's part of our culture, and it's very culturally accepted, and also like it gives kids joy for a while. But I mean, I also think that if your kid is, you know, old enough and they're asking you seriously, like, is the Tooth Fairy real or is Santa real? That is perfectly fine and good, you know, if you really think they're asking and they want to know the answer, to tell them the truth. But there's always
I think it's right that there's a sort of like subtle but real distinction between not telling and telling a lie, right? There's like, it's sort of like, you don't have to say, by the way, you might be interested to learn the Tooth Fairy is an imaginary thing and it's just me. And that's why you never get the amount of money that you said, do you take Venmo? There's a difference between sort of offering that and literally, you know, telling a lie in the moment.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember like when my kids, sometimes when I felt like they didn't really want to know yet, but they would kind of be like, it's when they were 4 and 5, I didn't like lie and say, yes, the Santa's real, but I just kind of would like change the subject or be like, what do you think? And then change the subject. And they never caught on. What are your thoughts on this? And it worked out pretty well, but then my kids now, they now know the truth. And they don't hate me. No, they're not like, why did you lie about this for so long? Like they're not mad about it.
It's true. Okay, so I have a couple more questions for you, but I also want to tell people, once I finish my interrogation, and we're very happy to take some questions from you. So if you guys just put things in the chat, I will funnel them. But I wanted to ask about two sort of hard things, because one of the things I really like about the book is it goes into some of these conversations, topics that are tough to talk about with our kids and tough to think about. So one is around the questions of inappropriate touching, and sort of thinking about the balance of, you know, with a kid who is young, what you learned about sort of how we talk to them about identifying and reporting inappropriate touching were it to happen, without almost conveying that this is something that they should be afraid of. And I think for me, that's the fundamental tension, that like these aren't issues I want to surface very much with my 6-year-old. I don't want him to think that there's something like that out there, but yet I really want him to understand if that happened, that he would come to me. So tell me.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And these are really hard topics to navigate. Yeah. So I guess I'll start before we get into the nitty gritty of like how to have that conversation, which I'm happy to say. I'll start by saying, I think like we can lay some groundwork that's really helpful with our kids when they're really starting from when they're really young, which is to have conversations about bodies, body parts, body autonomy from the time like kids are really young. So that means, using the right words for their body parts and not sort of shrouding body parts in like shame or because when we use like euphemisms, I think it tells kids like these are things you shouldn't really be talking about with us. Like it can hinder them opening up to you if there ever is something they need to tell you. And it also just like creates this kind of like cloud of like confusion and taboo-ness that I think is not very constructive. So, but also talking about like body autonomy. And by that, I mean, like telling your kids that, it's up to them if they like, if they want to hug or kiss other people rather than like telling them go hug your grandma, like right now, giving them that sense that like what you do with your body, like other people are not in charge of what you do with your body. Like you're in charge. And that means, that, it's up to you. Like you can tell people if you don't want to be touched. And if, and you should ask permission to touch other people. And like another way you can kind of convey that too, is like asking their permission before you do things to their bodies. Like before you pull their shirt up to look at their boo-boo, or like when you do tick checks, like instead of just like walking up to them and like pulling their shirt up saying like, okay, I'm going to give you a tick check now. Like, is that all good? Sorry, we do a lot of tick checks in our house.
Yeah, me too.
And I think, and then like also like privacy comes into this too, where like, even if you're a family talking to kids about privacy, even if you're a family that doesn't mind nakedness and like everybody sees each other naked, you can still kind of like convey to kids that not everybody wants people to see them naked, and people have boundaries. And so like, even though I don't mind you coming into the bathroom when I'm in the bathroom, can you please knock and just double check that I'm okay with it? And sort of creating these understandings about like boundaries and nakedness and things like that. So like, there are a lot of conversations you can have that sort of set up this idea that, that kids are in charge of their own bodies, which I think is just a really important thing to convey. And then though, yeah. So how do you talk to kids about like, touching without inappropriate touching without totally freaking them out? I actually, I recently had this conversation with my daughter. I was trying to anyway. And it was during a tick check. And I basically said like, I'm your mom and you know what I'm doing. And so I'm checking you for ticks and that's why it's okay. And like, I want to make sure that unless you're in a situation in which you are in danger, like if she walks into a street, it's okay for somebody to grab her and pull her back and so she doesn't get hit. But if you're not in a situation in which you could get hurt, you're always allowed to say no when people ask to touch you or try to touch you. And that's, true of any body part, but, including or especially any of your private parts. And you can say no to kids. And you can also say no to adults, unless they're a really, really trusted adult and it's for your safety. It's tricky because
so they don't know. Right? I mean, it's like, this is exactly right. Like, of course it is exactly right. But you can tell even saying it here, it's like, it's well, but
you know what though? I think it's mostly weird for us because we know what we're saying. Because so when I had this conversation with my daughter, I said like, so and I also said, it's also like, it doesn't matter if the touching doesn't hurt. Like if you don't want to be touched, even if it doesn't hurt, you can still say no. Like, because I think that sometimes, that's something that needs to be conveyed too. Or if the touching just makes you feel weird, you can say no. But I did say to her after having this conversation where I felt like, oh my God, this is so awkward. And she must be getting some weird vibes from this. I was like, has anybody ever touched you in a way you didn't like? And she was like, yeah, a couple of people have hit me. And like, she totally didn't, and like over her head, but at the same time, like, I think the communication was useful, but like, she was not aware of what I was getting at. She was just like, oh, has anybody, actually, a couple kids at school, like have touched me and they've hit me, or like they touched my arm and I didn't want them to touch my arm. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. Exactly. But so I didn't freak her out. I really don't think I freaked her out. She was like, and then she changed the subject and was like singing a minute later, So, but I still think that it's good to have these, even if a little bit of it is going over their head. And I also said, like, if anybody ever touches you and you can always tell me, no matter what anyone ever tells you, like, you can always talk to me about it. And that you will never be in trouble. It would never be your fault. And like, also making sure to lay that groundwork so that they wouldn't think like I would be mad or something. But it's awkward. I mean, I felt totally weird having this conversation because I knew what I was trying to say, but
I think you're right that like we're projecting what we know the conversation to be about, but that's not how they're hearing it because it's not. So that's an interesting insight. Yeah,
it's weird, right?
Okay, so we have a couple of good questions. So I'm actually just going to move to them, and I may come back with my hard question at the end. So one is the question of in the traits, whether we think of it as nature versus nurture. So you sort of think about like how important is what we do versus just like some kids are, I don't know, have a growth mindset or whatever it is to begin with.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wish there was like a clear answer. There isn't. But I mean, having looked at the research, there is definitely evidence that how you parent can absolutely shape the development of different traits. Like this is, I mean, I don't think I would have a book. I wouldn't have been able to write this book if that weren't the case, because there really is this research that shows that like when kids experience X or their parents do this over time or whatever, those kids change in ways that, kids who experience different parenting don't, so there are these differences. However, I mean, my two kids, like they have very different temperaments and they have very different, they had very different like starting points for different traits. Like with generosity, for instance, like my 7-year-old is very just always been naturally generous. Like she always wants to share things. She always, like if she gets Halloween candy, she wants to share it with all her friends and she runs out like after 2 weeks because of that. Whereas my 10-year-old like doesn't want to share anything. He never, he hoards his Halloween candy. Like he's very wary of sharing. And that's how they started out. And it's really interesting because I started trying these approaches that I was reading about on them. And it's not like, they suddenly equalized and like my 10-year-old was suddenly like super, super generous, but I actually did see more changes in him because he had like more to travel, I think, than I did in her, but like it changed. They really did seem to make a difference. Now, of course, he grew up too. So you have all these like confounding factors like age, who knows? So I think that, I mean, certainly kids are born different and they're going to have different starting points and there's going to be stuff that you can only go so far, but I do think that our parenting does make a difference.
So that actually is, there's a question here about what is the thing from this, the biggest takeaway that you've incorporated into your parenting? So what is the thing you changed the most post research?
Oh, that's good because there's two that are coming to mind and I now have a lot more conversations with my kids about difficult, awkward things. And it runs the gamut. So I talk to my kids a lot more about like gender stereotypes and sexism and like when they see things portrayed in the media that seem sexist or, in some way like imbalanced, like I will talk about it with my kids. And I find that now my kids want to talk about it with me a lot too. That goes for race as well. I mean, I don't talk, it's not like I'm talking about race all the time, but I am having more conversations than I used to because I now, I've looked at the research on that and I recognize that that's constructive. And also sex, pornography, things that I really just didn't want to ever talk to my kids about because of what I read. I've been having just so many more conversations and I'm finding that like it's becoming less awkward because of course all these things are like really weird to talk about and really hard and you feel like you can't do it right, like you're making mistakes. But I have found that the more I've done it, the easier it's gotten. And I feel like the lines of communication have gotten much stronger with my kids in these areas because of that too, which is really nice. Like they just, I think that's probably the biggest difference, biggest change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. This is like, I'm going to do some of these things. That's very good. Okay. Social media. Should we be concerned that it is turning our kids into assholes? Is the FOMO, is the social media at fault? What do we know?
Yeah, that is such a tricky question too, because the research is really hard to decipher there. I mean, I know you've looked at it too, Emily, and because part of the problem is a lot of the research like lumps screen time and use of technology together into just like as one thing. And like kids who spend more time on screens are, what's the relationship between that and their overall well-being? Well, it's like you don't see much of an effect. And part of that is because it really depends on what kids are doing online. Social media, I mean, there's some research that suggests that, yeah, like kids who are doing things on social media where they're constantly like comparing themselves to others and getting these like feelings of being left out, and that is not good. On the other hand, some of the surveys suggest that surveys of teens say that, actually social media like makes me happier and brings me closer to my friends and helps me connect with the friends that I really care about. So it's really hard because it really depends on the kid, I think. And it depends on the social media they're using and how they're using it. There's like no single answer to this. But I also think that like, to the extent that you can kind of delay introducing your kids to social media, if it doesn't hold them back from, what their social lives, like if all of their friends in fifth grade are using phones and social media, then it's really hard to hold back because that's keeping them from their friends. But at the same time, if you can convince your close groups of parents, all to hold off on like phones and social media till kids are in high school, like that's great. I think there's like I think it's good to try to delay it for as long as you can, to the extent that it's not like gonna really be different.
For me, there was like such a strong parallel when I read the stuff about social media in adolescence between that and kind of social media in like early parent, in like basically postpartum social media, that like on the one hand, it's like there's so much value to sort of having an online community where like when you're up in the middle of the night and you're like trying to figure out what to do with your baby and it hasn't slept and you're exhausted and the poop is a weird color and what, like, it's really great to have this online, this other people who are doing exactly what you're doing, even if you're like immediate physical, close physical people are kind of not there. It like grows your community. But at the same time, there's this sort of like, why does that fit model already have a six pack? And like, I can't believe what I'm looking at in the mirror, and she also had, so there's like sort of, there's like the dueling, it's helping me, but it's also making me feel bad. And I kind of feel like there's a parallel in what we see in adolescents also, that they're able to connect in a way that they maybe wouldn't otherwise. And yet there's the FOMO. I don't know if FOMO is the right word, but.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's like it's a double-edged sword in a way.
It's a double-edged sword. Yeah. Instagram is great until it's not.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah.
It's true. Okay. So somebody asks, when your kid is in fact the asshole, because let's face it, no matter how many times you read your book, sometimes your kid is the one. What do you do? What is the sort of evidence-based punishment approach? Is it a kind of punishment to take away privileges? Is it talking and chatting and talking about how they make people feel and apologizing? Like what do you do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think also it doesn't have a single answer, because in a way it does depend on the kid and the family. But yeah, I dug into a lot of the research on parenting styles and approaches to discipline. And it's really interesting because, I mean, the evidence is very clear that authoritative parenting is the best approach. But what does that mean? So that's like being warm and responsive and, negotiating sometimes with your kids, having conversations about why you're asking them to do things, but also setting boundaries, having, clear boundaries and also potentially having consequences when those boundaries are crossed or when the rules are broken. I think what I find is a lot of kids misbehave, or with my kids, they misbehave in part because they don't have the skills that we expect them to, or, they just, it's not often in my, so again, because this is, I do feel like it really depends on the kid, but I find my kids will act out, and I will feel like sometimes they're doing it on purpose. They're doing it to make me mad, like they know better. But really, like after having read a lot of the research and after writing this book, I feel like I'm much more aware of the fact that, well, actually, I think they're acting out for a very different reason. Like they just can't function right now for whatever reason, or they're really anxious, or they're really dealing with this transition. And there's all these, other things that are shaping their behavior. That's not just like they're just being assholes, basically. And so I find now that like talking with them, trying to understand what's really going on, explaining why that behavior isn't okay, and saying, here, let's talk about what we can do next time. What could you do that could help you, not throw the book across the room next time? Like, what is another way to deal with this? And try to like work with them to figure out what can be a good like solution that you could all work towards. And then, though, I do think consequences are okay. So this is another big like thing that I came across, is there's this idea, I think now in like the positive parenting sphere, that like you should never, ever, ever punish your kids in any way. And that's dangerous, and it's
People
horrible.
are always telling me that.
But that's not what is really authoritative parenting. Like that authoritative parenting does include consequences. So you can have consequences. I don't think you should be spanking your kids. But timeouts, if there's also like timeouts are often done wrong, but if you're doing them correctly, then it's okay to have consequences. But it just doesn't, I don't think you need to have consequences as your go-to, like anytime your kid is misbehaving, there's a consequence, because there are these other reasons that really are out of their control sometimes for behaving the way they do. So it really kind of depends on the situation, what you think is going on, how in control they are of themselves, and what your kid responds to too, because some kids respond to punishment. My kids really like to, like they misbehave, but they also really want to please us. And so they get really sad when they have a timeout. They don't have them frequently, but it really like makes them not want to do that thing again. And I do see like it does help, but I think other kids won't some other kids won't have that response.
Yeah, and I think it's also, there's a sort of like, one of my kids, when they have done something wrong, there is like in some ways like a deep feeling of shame. And so they're like, we try to be quite careful about, sort of consequences for that child, because, on the one hand, sometimes that is sort of like, it's very meaningful, but it's sort of meaningful it is partly meaningful because he feels so bad about it. And, that's like, you kind of want to make sure that you want to induce that feeling, as opposed to just like, yeah, okay, so you shouldn't, like, you guys were playing a game and like, you shouldn't have jumped on your sister, but like kind of she was kind of asking for it. That's like maybe, not,
yeah. It's like situation specific, kid specific,
family specific. It's hard.
I wish there was a simple answer.
I agree. I wish there was like a little like cheat book. We could be like, okay, what is it for that?
Right?
Okay, this is such a good question. Somebody sent in. So I'm just going to read the question. This is great. I spent last week at scout camp with 18 kids, 11 to 14. Many of these kids exhibited the traits that you analyzed. How do you talk to the parents about these kids when their kids are headed for being assholes, selfish, lazy, self-centered, greedy, etc.?
Oh, wow. That sounds really fun.
Yeah, it sounds like a scout camp. Sounds amazing.
Yeah. Well, I suggest that you just send them my book, but anonymously.
Right. Anonymously.
And just say like, here, we thought you might need this. Oh God, that's really, that's really hard. How do you talk to the parents? I mean, I think, and also like, can you talk to the kids? Like, I don't know, maybe that's not a thing that you're in. Maybe you can't do that at scout camp. I don't really know what's like allowed, but I mean, I do feel like it's okay for you, if you're in charge of these kids and they're being total dicks, like for you to like talk to them about their behavior and say, here's why it's not okay. And here's why it's like really making my life hard. And here's so as an aside, like one of the interesting little nuggets of research that I had not been aware of, but when I was researching the book, I discovered is that when kids are doing stuff that's like really not constructive. If it's something that's like hurting other people, even in an indirect way, or it makes your life harder when they do that thing, it really helps to like actually explain how it affects people. Like, so it's not just like if they leave their Legos on the floor and you yell at them, like, don't leave your Legos on the floor, you tie it to like, because I will step on it and it will really hurt me. And then like, I will be really hurt. So in a situation, like maybe at Scout Camp, if a kid's doing something that's just like really making other people's lives hard, to not just say, don't do that, but like say, here's why I'm asking you not to do this. It's hurting, it's I can't sleep anymore because you're whatever, being a jerk and like singing at the top of your lungs at midnight. But that's an aside, in part because I don't really have a good answer to your question. So I'm kind of trying to talk around it. I mean, I think,
talking to other people about their kids' behavior is like, even people who are very close to you is very hard.
So hard. I know. I mean, I think it is a good idea to try if you feel like you can, but I don't have a good script for you.
I totally agree. So we have a couple more minutes. And so I want to ask you about race, because I think this is something, I've thought a lot about in my writing and sort of talking to kids about race, and particularly talking to kids about race from the perspective of someone who is white, and sort of thinking about sort of surfacing those issues while acknowledging privilege, but also I would love to hear you just talk a little bit about both how what the science says about that, but then how you thought about writing about it.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. So I think that the default approach of many white parents, which is understandable, is to not talk about race, because we have this idea that, if we don't talk about it, our kids won't really see it. They won't make a big deal out of it. They won't become racist. And that's, I can understand, like, I think I used to think that too. And we were raised this way, most of us, if we're white, like our parents probably didn't talk about race a whole lot either. So it's like part of our like social DNA at this point.
Yeah.
But the research really contradicts this. And it shows that, kids do see race from a very young age. They see skin color, they're noticing it. And they're also noticing, importantly, the hierarchy that exists in society when it comes to race. And so they are seeing that, all but one president has been white. And they're seeing that like a lot of the kids maybe at school who are the wealthiest are white. And they're seeing that a lot of people who are working class are people of color. And they're seeing this play out like in the world in so many ways, this hierarchy. And the problem is if we or other grownups don't explain that there's the reason for this hierarchy is largely systemic racism, then kids are going to come to their own conclusions about this. And like the simplest conclusion that you can come to if you see this hierarchy and nobody's filling in the blanks is maybe white people are just better, right? And so this is the problem with not talking about race. And this is why we have to challenge those assumptions that kids might be making. And we have to explain that racism exists. And, it's not just people acting in a racist way towards each other, but like there's systemic problems that fuel it and keep it going. But it is really, really hard to do because, again, we've been socialized to not talk about it. And so how do you do it then? Like, how do you get over that hump and just start doing it? Like I found, and I wrote about this in my book, like one of the moments when I was like, shit, I need to have this conversation was when right after George Floyd had been murdered, and my daughter saw like a really disturbing picture on the front page of the newspaper and was like, Mommy, what's that about? And I, in that moment I was like, what do I do? How much do I tell her? And it was like a Saturday and we had nothing going on. And I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about what led up to that. I'm going to talk about racism and slavery. I mean, I think we talked about slavery before, but like I brought it in and I talked about police violence and then what was really, I messed it up. Like I fumbled, like I didn't know what I was saying. I'm sure I used like words that I should, like I wasn't framing it the right way.
Yeah.
I wasn't prepared. But then it was really interesting because like the next day she she brought it back up and she asked me a question. And by that point I'd had like a little bit of time to sort of think about how I wished I'd said things the day before. And so then I had a little bit of a better, conversation. We brought it forward even more. And then like, she asked me more questions. And so then it became like more of a dialogue. And I felt like it was I was becoming more prepared and able to deal with it. And we also started buying books that would help, because I think sometimes like it really is that hard that you want to look at books or videos. Like there's so many resources out there that can help like start conversations and also just explain concepts to your kids if you're not sure how to explain them. But then we don't talk about it like all the time. The op-ed I just wrote for the Times, which was all about talking to kids about race. I got so much hate mail from parents who thought I was basically saying like every conversation you ever have with your children should be about race and how like white people are terrible. And I'm like, that is not what I'm saying here. But anytime it seems at all relevant, like I will find a way to bring it up. Like if we're watching a movie and there's like only white people in it, I might say like, you guys notice like is there anybody who didn't have white skin in that movie? Like, what do you think? That's interesting. Like we try to talk about like these things that we see, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a sort of general thing with kids, which I think you often find when talking about hard stuff, that there's like not just one conversation the way you might have with adults. Like everything is many conversations. And so the sort of finding the moments in which either like there's an opening for them or you create an opening rather than imagining like, okay, we're just one time going to explain the entire history of racism and structural racism and inequity, and then we'll just like move on and everybody will understand. That's not realistic with adults, not even with certainly not with kids.
Yeah. And I feel like that is a really big take home, because that's the same thing when I talk to sex educators. They're like, parents think that they're supposed to have one talk with their kids about sex. It should not the talk, the birds and the bees talk. And it should not be that. It should be an ongoing dialogue. Like, and you should be bringing it up, and your kids should be bringing it up. And I mean, and sometimes I think we have to tune into the opportunities. I think sometimes we don't want to talk about it. So there's an opportunity. We just kind of like, that's, I'm gonna pretend that didn't happen, or that my kid didn't say that thing. That's actually a really good opening. But they do give us openings. Like they really do, if we're listening and if we are prepared to take on that challenge.
And I also find that, this is with some of these things, there are sort of other spaces and other adults can help. So, in our kids' school happens to be, this is like they do a lot of social justice and a lot of discussions of race, and that sort of frequently provides an opening for us to sort of fill it in, and also, generate situations in which sometimes we'll bring something up. My daughter was watching the 1982 Annie the other day, and so my husband said, I want to raise that. I don't know if you noticed, but there are some there's some, I actually haven't watched this, but I think that, as you might expect, based on the date, there are some dated stereotypes and difficult things. And, and he sort of brought this up, and then she started listing all the things he had come up with, plus a ton of other things that were also not appropriate about it. And it was like, okay, yeah. Yes, I did not think about that, but also that. So I think, we sometimes we don't always give them the credit that, for the things that they pick up on, which is exactly the point there.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I love that. My daughter now points out anything that she finds remotely sexist, and I love it. Like we were reading Grimm's fairy tales. Oh my God, those are the most disturbing. They are really so disturbing. Dark. They're so dark. She was reading them we were visiting my parents, and she found it, and she made my mom read them to her. And my mom was like, I'm really sorry. But every time there was a husband who bossed his wife around or whatever, she was like, that's so sexist. And I'm like, yes, it is. Yes.
We're constantly I think they're just pronouncing them. I was like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah. There's a lot of pronouncing in books. This was really great. I think Carrie is on to tell us that we are stopping.
I'm so sorry. I know I always pop on and scare people at the end. But yes, our time together has come to an end. It's very sad. That was fascinating, you guys, really, really fascinating stuff. And I really feel for the guy who said that he was with all those scouts, because
that sounds hard.
If you've ever coached a team or run a PTA or it's just that is terrifying. Talking to other parents, it's just the worst. They're worse than their kids. So totally thank you. That's such great advice. And I think, I know I jotted down a bunch of notes as well while you guys were talking. So Thank you so much for that. Again, thank you both for being here so much. I mean, we're just so grateful to have you here. Thank you to everyone out there who came and supported and purchased books tonight. We are so grateful for you as well. And other than that, I'm just going to say good night, and just a reminder that Emily has a new book coming out in 2 weeks as well. So
And you should all buy Melinda's book because it's so good. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Carrie.
Thank you
Bye,
so
guys.
much. This was so fun. Thank you, Emily.
Great.
Thank you,
Have a
Carrie.
great night, everybody. Stay safe.
Yes.